Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Yaroslav Trofimov has spent months on end at the heart of the conflict, very often on its front lines. In his authoritative book, he traces the war's decisive moments, from the battle for Kyiv to more recently the gruelling and bloody struggle involving Wagner Group over Bakhmut. And he shows how Ukraine and its allies have turned the tide against Russia in a modern-day battle of David and Goliath. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to see more of the incredible guests that we feature on the channel, and also do add a comment. It helps to drive these videos to a new audience in YouTube's algorithm. Do also check out the list, the extensive list of validated Ukrainian charities that we have in the description of the video. And if you like the material we produce, then do please consider buying me a coffee so we can continue the work of the channel. Yaroslav Trofimov is the chief foreign affairs correspondent of the Wall Street Journal and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in international reporting for 2 consecutive years in 2022 and 23. Before covering the Russia war on Ukraine, he reported on most major conflicts of the past 2 decades, serving as the journal's bureau chief in Afghanistan and Pakistan and correspondent in Iraq. He holds an MA from New York University and is the author of several highly critical and acclaimed books, including, and this is what we're going to be predominantly discussing today, Our Enemies Will Vanish, The Russian Invasion and Ukraine's War of Independence. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show and for giving me time to discuss the book and Ukraine.
Well, it's a huge privilege because I know you're doing a lot of sort of press discussions, and I know some of these book launch discussions, they'll merge into each other. So let's try and see if we can sort of really dig into your purpose and detail of the book, and hopefully ask some questions you might not have heard before. Yours is very much based on eyewitness, first-hand accounts of the war in Ukraine. Why is that so important when you compare it to, say, second or even third-hand theorizing that sometimes we get, especially in elements of the media and in the sort of big geopolitical discussions?
Well, I think the basic principle of journalism has always been to go and see for yourself and find out, because reality as seen on the ground, and thoughts as expressed by people experiencing these historic events, shaping them, are very often very different from what people think, from thousands of miles away, especially if the opinions are informed by the past. And Ukraine is a very fast changing country, and geopolitical conceptions about Ukraine that may have been partially correct in 2013, such as the division between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, are completely off the charts now.
And of course, I've been to many events where fantastic Ukrainian experts have spoken either on the cultural literary side or more on the political side, and something they are unfortunately incessantly kind of accused at, or it's hinted at, that because they are so directly involved, because it's an existential struggle for Ukraine and Ukrainians, that somehow means they cannot be dispassionate, they can be objective. The worst, of course, is when people might hint that actually, you might be a little bit emotional about this and not as detached. What would you argue here? Because, of course, you are Ukrainian by ancestry, and yet you are one of the world's leading journalists. So how would you deal with these sort of hints or even direct accusations?
Well, I think, it's evident in the book that it's not just me sitting and, venting my emotions. I go and see things to the front lines. I was in Kyiv when the war began, and, we went to Kharkiv front line, and as Kharkiv was about to be overrun, and then Donbass, the south. So I describe situations, I describe people, and I try to use measured language. And readers can draw the conclusions for themselves, because it is what people say, it's what people see, and it's what is happening. So I think, stepping back from that, and I'm often asked, how does it compare to cover a war in a country where you were born, to many other wars that I covered? I spent the last 20 years bouncing around conflict zones. I spent 5 years in Afghanistan. I covered the invasion in Iraq and the horrendous war insurgency that erupted afterwards. And on some level, it's much harder because it is more emotional. When you are in Kyiv and missiles are falling on the park where you had your first kiss as a teenager, and the hospital where your grandmother used to take you to check your eyes out, that is emotional. But on the other hand, it is much easier in a way to cover this war than other wars, because let's face it, most wars have moral ambiguity, and especially in the wars like Iraq, especially like a war like Afghanistan, they were flawed. They were not good guys then. In Ukraine, I think, I'm not saying this is Ukrainian, I think it's subjective analysis as far as I can offer one. It's probably the war with the most moral clarity since World War II. Ukraine hasn't done anything to threaten Russia, hasn't carried a cross-border raid to kill Russian civilians, hasn't done anything except just to want to live its own life and be left alone. And Russia would not leave it alone. And Russia wants to control it. Russia wants to resurrect its colonial might and deny the very existence of Ukrainians, not just as a government, but as a state and as a people and as a culture. Because more and more you hear from Russia that the Ukrainian language is invented by the Austro-Hungarian intelligence. So I think this moral clarity really removed the element of conflict of interest. If I were with the Ukrainian forces and I would see them behaving, breaking the laws of war, torturing people, burning houses, whatever, then it would have been a real issue. But I haven't witnessed that. And I know there were some instances of atrocities committed by Ukrainian forces, but they were quite limited, and I personally haven't witnessed it.
And that's an interesting element, isn't it, of the proportionality, which I guess as a journalist, that's something you're always trying to balance: the proportionality, the focus on a particular element versus another, which, let's say, Russian atrocity is on a much, much greater scale. When it comes to propaganda, however, false equivalence is an absolutely critical element of Russian propaganda. It's a kind of weaponized whataboutism, and unfortunately, it's highly effective, especially in the extreme quarters of the left, the right, and sometimes even the center. How's journalists do you trying to pick apart these weaponized narratives, and especially this sort of false equivalence, which I think can all too often creep into mainstream media reporting as well?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have seen through this conflict that Russian propaganda is actually stronger than the Russian army, and that's what they really excel at. And even as the Soviet Union had collapsed as a global power and empire, and its economy crumbled, the ability to carry out psyops, the ability sort of to manipulate the Western public opinion and the international public opinion was one of the capabilities that remained and was nurtured, and is actually where Russia still is a superpower. And the thing is that most people had no idea about Ukraine before this war. What was Ukraine? It's a country that was made up. You could hear it all the time. It's not a real country, and that's what Putin was telling everyone. And I think, honestly, most people in Europe and the US really thought that the Ukrainians really are kind of like Russians. Whatever, they have some funny dialect. And that propaganda was pierced by the fact that the Ukrainians are not Russians, and the Ukrainians, defying everyone's expectations, not just in Moscow, but also in Washington, did not surrender. They fought, and they brought the mighty Russian army to a standstill and pushed it back and regained half of the land that was initially occupied. But the Russian propaganda message is multi-pronged. So they say 5 different things that are mutually exclusive, and hoping that every segment of the audience will buy that message.
And have you found yourself explaining what would seem to you, and in fact to most Ukrainians, sort of an obvious facet of reality there? Have you had to explain these things to colleagues, and have you found yourself perhaps even getting frustrated with having to repeat these same truisms over the last 2 years?
Well, I think coming back to where we started, there was this perception of division in Ukraine between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. And I think, people kind of like to label identities, especially in places that I know very little about. And it seemed natural to many people, well, the Russian speakers obviously must like Russia, they speak Russian. And I found even some colleagues, especially ahead of the invasion, were like, well, of course, And people until now circulate these maps of the election of, 2010, 2004, showing, hey, he's centered in the West, what for pro-Western candidate, and the East and the South pro-Russian. But all these divisions really disappeared in 2014, and especially with this war. And I recount how in the book, in January 2022, I traveled throughout Donbass and Eastern Ukraine, Kharkiv, ahead of the invasion, trying to gauge really, will people really support Russia? And in Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, the sentiment in 2014 was kind of pro-Russian. I would say more than half of the population thought Russia is a good thing. Russia means higher salaries, better standard of living, higher pensions. And then they saw what happened in Donbass, where Russia actually was, unlike in Kharkiv, successful and created these two proxy statelets, the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which became, depopulated very quickly because there were just gangster ruled wastelands or no jobs, no development was happening. More than half of the population of this statelets fled to Ukraine, to the West, to Russia. And so for 8 years, Russian-speaking Ukrainians had this vivid example of what happens under Russian rule, and nobody wanted that in 2022. And that's why there was such fierce resistance throughout, the East and the South, and especially in places like Kharkiv. And so in another episode in the book, I meet up once again with the mayor of Kharkiv, Igor Terehov, as usual in the subway, because at that time it was the only safe space to sleep in Kharkiv, because the city was being shelled every few minutes. And he tells me, look, we in Kharkiv kind of used to think sympathetically of Russia, but the opinion has changed 180 degrees for generations, because it's the people who are Russian speakers of Eastern Ukraine. Those are the people who experienced the brunt of Russian genocidal violence, as he put it. They're the ones who lost their relatives, their homes, their livelihoods, had to flee. And so, especially to them, the war was something that was real lived pain, as opposed to people in the Western Ukraine who traditionally were anti-Russian, maybe, but for whom the war, luckily for them, was pretty much something on TV, not something that they experience every day, in a war zone.
And this first-hand experience, either directly or through family or being a volunteer since 2014, of which many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, even prior to full-scale war, had experience of volunteering on the front, it seems to me there's a common understanding about what victory entails. Entails recovery of land, it entails justice, having an economy that is sort of consistent and not under threat, returning the children, the many tens and tens of thousands of children who've been kidnapped. But also there seems to me, amongst the Ukrainians I've spoken to, a very distinct understanding that there is liberation, that taking Crimea and Donbass is a liberating process, and that many people in those territories, some, of course, we know will have been brainwashed, but many people in those territories will see that as a genuine liberation, like the scenes we saw in Kherson and other areas when they liberated. Has that concept really filtered through to international decision makers? Because I've overheard conversations, or secondhand or even firsthand, where there's a lot of angst, I think, amongst Western allies. They don't quite understand that this is a liberating process of these territories. They're still perhaps thinking it's either physically impossible, or it's going to take on more of the characters of conquest, and that perhaps there's people there who really don't want to be part of Ukraine, etc., etc. Have we got a bit of a divergence here that needs to be resolved?
I think Well, there are three categories of territories, right? We have Crimea, which was annexed to Russia in 2014, and without any violence to speak of, and where there was quite a significant population replacement, because several 100,000 Russians from Russia moved there, maybe close to 700,000, and a few 100,000 fled, especially the Crimean Tatars. Then you have Donbass, the Russian-controlled, statelets of Donbass that accounted for about 1/3 of Donbass before the full-scale invasion. And there you had massive depopulation. More than half the population fled, and you have hundreds of thousands of people from Donetsk and Lugansk who are in Kyiv now. The Ukraine's national security advisor used to be the mayor of Luhansk. And then you have the areas that were conquered in these last 2 years, where also a large part of the population had fled. When the Russians took Bakhmut, there was no one there, maybe 2 or 3 families. And so when we look at the people who are currently in Donbass, how representative are they of the actual population of Donbass? And probably, many people in Donetsk right now are pro-Russian. But if you were to have a referendum on everyone who used to be there in 2014, I doubt that, because I've met many, many passionate Ukrainian patriots from Donbass, including the Ukrainian army, including in Kyiv, and the same goes for Crimea. There are many, many Crimeans who are, including the current Minister of Defense, who are very much patriots of Ukraine.
Well, that's important to really get across the understanding of replacement of population, and actually the idea of rewarding the colonizer population is morally quite misguided. Coming back to an earlier point you made as well, comparing different sort of war zones, another narrative which does seem to unfortunately cut through is that this is a proxy war by the US or whoever, that it's for territory, resources, etc., etc. These arguments do seem to depersonalize and kind of cut through with certain segments of the population. But doesn't that ignore, in your view, a couple of significant things? I mean, one is the role of Ukrainian identity and culture and the genocidal nature of the Russian invasion. The other one, of course, is a big motivating factor of Ukrainians, is something I've been learning a lot about over the last 2 years, because I really watched it at a distance, which was Maidan and the ethos, ethics, and the activation, political activation that occurred in Maidan has really been an awakening for many hundreds of thousands of people, and their lives and their careers and their identities now can be traced back to that event, or if they're a little bit older, perhaps the Orange Revolution as well. This rarely gets an airing, I think, in arguments around both the origins of the war and why Putin is attacking, but also in explaining Ukrainian resilience and why this war is fundamentally different from, say, Iraq and others, where you don't have this huge, let's say, organic, democratic change that underpins it.
Well, I think I'll start from the end. And I think the difference between the war in Ukraine and the war in Iraq or Afghanistan is fundamental. In Iraq and in Afghanistan, you had a foreign invasion, for reasons that could be good or bad, depending on your opinion. But the fact is that foreign armies came in, ousted the, no doubt, evil government that was in place, and then replaced it with something that was not popular and not necessarily competent, and there was an insurgency. And basically the war was a civil war between an insurgency that claimed to be nationalist and that defended the honor of the country from the infidels, and a Western propped, puppet government, at least in the beginnings. And in Afghanistan, the insurgency won. And Iraq, because of different religious makeup, a different accommodation was found, and the U.S. troops are still there. In Ukraine, there is no pro-Russian force to speak of. So the Ukrainians are fighting a foreign invasion, and that's it. And so it's organic. It's very simple to explain to every Ukrainian soldier what are you fighting for? It wasn't simple to explain to an Afghan soldier. What is he fighting for? Because his cousin may be, in the Taliban. And so having spent much of my life in covering those wars, it's a very stark difference that's really easy to understand. Now, if you look at the Ukrainian history and Russia, to Russia, the existence of a truly independent Ukraine is a threat to its foundational myth. The first thing the President Putin did, one of the first things he did since coming to power, was to build a giant statue of Prince Volodymyr of Kyiv, after whom he and Zelensky are named, to sort of stake the claim to the heritage of the Kyiv Rus, which was, the first state based in Kiev from which modern Russia, Belarus, and obviously Ukraine sprang up. And by claiming that heritage, you can't really accept that Ukraine is an independent country, because who are these Ukrainians? If we are the descendants of the Kyiv Rus, who are they? And that's why traditional Russian historiography since the 17th century tried to present Moscow as a direct heir and descendant of the Kiev state, and Ukraine itself being relegated to not really having its own identity. And the political culture, coming back to your question about Maidan and other things, if we look at the Ukrainian history after 1991, since independence, there was only one president of many in Ukraine who actually won re-election. So Ukrainians, by their nature, don't like authoritarian rule. They don't like dictatorships. And, they don't like this sort of cult of personality, the father of the nation. Whereas Putin has been in power one way or another for now 24 years. And so I think this is a basic difference. And that's also, potentially a problem for Zelensky after the war, because, Ukrainians are not fighting for Zelensky. You will not find people, waving Zelensky portraits. I haven't seen any in the front lines. He's respected. He's recognized as the symbol of Ukraine, as the president, as legitimate authority. But there's no cult of Zelensky. There's more cult of Zelensky in the West, or at least there used to be, than in Ukraine.
That's interesting, isn't it? And it is something that propaganda has really sort of tried to leverage, but it doesn't really work in Ukraine. They've also tried to amplify the divisions between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, of which, of course, there are going to be disagreements. If we were to see a transcript of all Churchill's conversations with de Gaulle, that would make a very fascinating reading. So there's always going to be these sort of...
Or Truman and MacArthur.
Yes. But, propaganda is really trying to play the divide and rule card there. But do you think Ukrainians really are not going to fall for that? Because there does seem to be an intensification of Russian disinformation activity to try and sow political division within Ukraine.
So, my book opens with me going to meet the former president, Petro Poroshenko, the day before the war. Literally hours before the Russian invasion, and we had this conversation about Ukrainian history. And he said a very correct thing, that throughout history, Ukraine lost its freedom because of internal divisions. And at that moment, he said, despite all my differences with Zelensky, who wants to put me in jail, we're going to stand united in the face of the enemy until the war is over. And I think Ukrainians have learned that lesson. If you look at what happened to Ukrainian statehood in the early 20th century, a coup, strife, and the Bolsheviks took advantage of this and wiped out the Ukrainian state. If you look at all the rivalries, of the two rival hetmans in the 17th and 18th centuries, the same. And so I think this history, and if you look at what happened after the Orange Revolution, when again this squabbles between President Yushchenko and Prime Minister Tymoshenko opened the way to Yanukovych and his turn towards Russia. So I think this history is in the bones of Ukrainians, and they realize that the biggest threat to them is not Russia, but internal strife, internal discord. And so, yes, of course, there are differences between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. They're all strong personalities, and obviously, if you are a military commander, you see things that are relevant militarily. If you are a political leader, you also have other considerations, and you see maybe more holistic picture, or maybe you don't understand the tactics as well. There's a natural differences, but I think so far they haven't spilled over. So far, they have shown they can work together, and I think most Ukrainians hope that it will continue this way.
And this is a fascinating point, isn't it? Because what I've learned through these, interviewing many dozens of Ukrainians over the last 2 years, and you're right, prior to that, my knowledge of Ukraine was sketchy at best, is that what was inherited from the Orange Revolution, Maidan, and there's values that have emerged from that, but also Ukrainian language, literature, identity, and the distinct cultural parts that are actually, distinct from Russia. These seem to provide a point of unity, which is above or more important than political differences or personal differences. Not always, but it's some sort of really, it's a strength there. Is there a challenge though in the West? Because we've got used to identity really being a sort of negative label, because we don't think of our identities as being under existential threat. So you have, MAGA versus libtards, you have Brexit versus Remainer, etc. You have what tends to be quite negative labeling of identity, and also the very idea of nationalism has come to be seen as not a strength, but generally in more negative terms. And yet, I think in Ukraine, people will say that fundamentally there is something actually uniting and strong if you can build it around certain commonalities of values. And that includes having a clear concept of national identity and purpose.
So obviously, Ukraine did not start with this conflict. And if we look at the history of Ukrainian nationalism, it has very dark pages. There was this concept of so-called integral nationalism, which was one of the, let's say, fascist ethno-nationalist ideologies of the 1930s. And that was, in many of its manifestations, very anti-Semitic and generally, totalitarian. I think Ukrainians after World War II had, and many of the Ukrainian thinkers at the time were in the camps in Siberia. They were in the same camps with Polish nationalists and dissidents, with lots of Jewish dissidents, the refuseniks. And so in that environment, there was quite a rethink of what it means to be a Ukrainian nationalist. And when these people returned, and I knew many of them, like Lev Kolokyan, when they returned from prison and started political activism in 1989, 1990, kind of the Ruch movement, there was a recognition that the Ukrainian idea of the modern day has to be inclusive. It's not blood and soil. It's not language. It's not religion. Everybody in Ukraine is a Ukrainian because otherwise the country will not survive. Which led to this historic reconciliation with Poland. And if you remember, Poland used to be seen as Ukraine's biggest enemy. And so, and merit here also goes to the same sort of development in Poland, like the Kultura magazine in Warsaw, in Paris, and this whole generation of then exiled Polish intellectuals who returned to Poland and said that, a free Poland needs a free Ukraine. We should abandon, territorial disputes. We should not raise the question of borders. Recognize that Lviv is Ukrainian now. And so that remarkable reconciliation and remarkable reinventing of Ukrainian nationalism, which then became the foundation of the Act of Independence. And I talked a lot about this with Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine. I think I'm quoting him in the book about that. That's really what ensured the survival of Ukraine, because it's a country where someone of Jewish background can be president, someone of Muslim who's Muslim can be Minister of Defense. The head of the land forces is a Russian, originally born in Russia, but who adopted the Ukrainian identity. The previous foreign minister was also originally from Russia. So it's a country where I think the answer to the question in modern Ukraine of are you Ukrainian is a question: do you think the collapse of the Soviet Union was a good or bad thing? And if you think that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was great, then you're Ukrainian. That's a very simple test, I think.
And it's possible to talk about things also in abstract terms, but I'm fascinated by your first-hand experience, both during the war and also people you've spoken to. When you speak to sort of some correspondents, I think Luke Harding in particular still stressed this point when I spoke to him, what you've got is the Russian vertical. You've got a essentially inorganic, top-led autocratic system. And if you take it even down to the culture, whether it's popular or literary culture, it tends to be fairly top-down and prescribed by the state. That's not to comment on its quality. A lot of it is not the best quality, but it's a process. And that's reflected in many facets of society, including religion, which is not necessarily organic process in Russia either. It's a political instrument. Would you characterize Ukraine as being the antithesis of that, more horizontal, forward-looking, innovative, where a whole raft of things are actually more bottom-up as opposed to imposed upon society? And what's the impact within its resistance in the war, if that's true?
I think up to a point. Obviously, Ukraine has suffered from Soviet legacy, and there's still lots of learned behaviors that remain there, especially in the East and South. But yes, Ukrainian society has always been, tales, prides itself in its traditions of the Cossacks, the free men who escaped their lords and created their own states, the siege in Zaporizhia. And that's seen as the foundation of the national culture. And obviously, if you look at the history of Ukraine, it was for a long time part of the Western world. City of Kyiv, had the Magdeburg Law, so it's the citizens of Ukrainian cities had rights in a way that the citizens of many Russian cities never had. And so there is no such top-down mentality, and religion as well. The fact that Ukraine has several churches means that none of them is really relevant politically. And so the sort of idea of a diversity of beliefs is ingrained in the diversity of society, which is a source of strength right now. I think that if you look at the military as such, Putin clearly thought that it's going to be easy to win because it's a big Soviet army against a small Soviet army. And Ukraine's army has still lots of Soviet holdovers, but it's not a Soviet army. In part because of all the experience since 2014, where this independent energy of the volunteer battalions, volunteers helping, it was infused into it. And all of these people who really passionately believed in their cause, but also came from different backgrounds, sort of fertilized the thinking within the rest of the military. And again, the military had, especially its senior officers, had almost 8 years of training by British, Canadian, American instructors. And the principle of mission command, which is central to NATO doctrine, where the commander declares the overall intent, but then delegates to the commanders at local levels, with brigade commanders, the authority how to carry out operations, is what really saved Ukraine when the Russians invaded, because the Russians came from 11 different directions. Zaluzhny and the general staff were overwhelmed. They were being under missile attacks. And so if everything had to go and to be routed through Kyiv, then they probably wouldn't have had the capacity to command it. And delegating this initiative, and the fact that there was this trust, and the fact that there was this habit of independent action, allowed, in most places, commanders to mount resistance. Not in all places. There were failures in the south, particularly. And that sort of way of managing the war, that level of trust, I think only exists in a democratic society that is not ruled by fear, which is the case in Russia.
Fear and brutality. We'll come on to brutality in a minute, because that's been a defining feature of how Russia's behaved. But what you describe in the book there is a David and Goliath struggle. And this idea of Ukraine as an underdog, that seems to be especially appealing to the British mindset in particular. But you've also documented these critical junctures in the war where things could have gone one way or the other. And actually, there's been some major successes that Ukraine has achieved, including during this period of so-called stalemate, which again is a relatively lazy label that certain portions of the media seem to reach for as a simplistic narrative. What, in your view, were the key turning points or the key events that you document in the book, and how significant were internal, let's say, Ukrainian strengths versus assistance that may have been rendered by allies?
I think the key turning point was this in the very first days. It was the first, say, month of the war, between the invasion on February 24th and the Russian pullback from Kyiv and northern Ukraine on March 29th. That's the moment when Ukraine fought and won its war of independence. That's when the state showed it could survive. And all of that was done pretty much without any Western assistance. There was always trumpeted American military aid before the invasion, but it was aid for an insurgency. It was because everybody accepted the army to collapse. It was not aid for a big standing army. The U.S. shipped 90 Javelin missiles ahead of the war, 990. It's against thousands of Russian tanks coming across the border. The U.K. And Prime Minister Johnson were more helpful. And, there were about 2,000 NLAW missiles shipped by the UK, which I did see in the front lines, and which did play some role. But initially, the Russians were repelled almost exclusively because of the Soviet vintage weapons that the Ukrainian army had: artillery, MLRS, and initially, aviation. A lot of Ukrainian planes got shot down on the early days, and pilots died. So that was the existential first battle. The Western assistance started pouring in when Russia withdrew from the north and focused on Donbass. And by April, Ukraine just started running out of ammunition. And in Donbass, the death rates were horrendous. 200-300 soldiers were dying every day. And so that's when the trickle of Western weapons started to flow. And think throughout this process, looking back at it, it was always too little too late because of Russia's nuclear threats. From the very beginning, if you remember, in the morning when the war started, President Putin said that if you dare to interfere in this war, you will see the consequences, the likes of which you have never seen before, quote unquote. And every time the fear of Russian nuclear retaliation was probably like one of the main considerations in the West. I'm quoting a senior Pentagon official in the book who's saying that, well, look, the Venn diagram of our interests, Ukrainian interests, overlaps, but only about to 85%, because we still have responsibility that humanity is not extinguished. And so that explained the delay in the shipment of tanks, fighting vehicles, Patriot missiles, and F-16 jets that still haven't arrived but are presumably on the way. And so every time that Russian red line was breached, there was no reaction from Russia. And so, but by holding out this threat, Russia managed to really slow down supply. And the argument that many are making, that many in my book are making, is that Russia was at its weakest in the late summer of 2022. Putin refused to recognize the reality, refused to listen to his military and mobilize the military. There were only about 100,000 combat troops in Ukraine. This was the time when Ukraine could have pushed through Russian lines all the way to the Sea of Azov, because Ukraine actually had a substantial numerical superiority in the field. What it didn't have was gear. Western tanks were denied, Western artillery systems were limited, no Bradleys, no Strikers, no Leopards. But once that historical opportunity was missed, and all this so-called mountain of steel really did arrive the following year, it was just too late, because Russia had mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers. General Surovikin, the Russian commander, built the Surovikin line, massive fortifications and minefields. And so when Ukraine did finally use this mountain of steel, it failed. And the counteroffensive of 2023 did not achieve significant results.
And is that fear of the nuclear threat, which people like Medvedev seem to deliver on a nearly daily basis, is that still conditioning the responses in, say, Washington, Berlin? Because it does seem that supply of Taurus, for instance, is a no-brainer. The use of Storm Shadow and Scalp has shown what can be achieved. And in recent weeks, the destruction of a number of Russian of a significant value, helicopters, planes, etc., either by air defense or Storm Shadow, shows how incredibly effective these systems can be in Ukrainian hands. But is the decision to send or not send or delay the send still being conditioned by Russian nuclear threats?
I think it is. I think it is. And obviously, we have the case of ATACMS, which seems to be a red line for the US until now. The US did send some shorter range ATACMS for a very specific purpose of destroying, airfields that had helicopters on them. And they were really, those sort of cluster ATACMS that were only useful for that particular mission. There was only a few dozen of them. But other than that, ATACMS of a longer range are still seen in Washington as too provocative to Russia. And I think that nuclear fear still drives policy to Ukraine's detriment.
And the other narrative, which even Putin has used, is this so-called fear of a Russian collapse. On the one hand, I hear from people that is a genuine concern amongst Russian policymakers, because behind the scenes they know the Potemkin facade of Russian power is hiding, all sorts of ills and problems, brittleness and fragility. But at the same time, they do actually still use that argument again to try and influence behavior. Is your view that Berlin and Washington are very much influenced by this idea that we cannot push Russia too hard or they'll collapse and it'll be terrible for everybody? I kind of get the impression the British really, are not quite so swayed by that, because, empires come, empires go. And most Ukrainians would seem to be of the view that actually the collapse of Russia would be the very best thing, not only for Ukrainians, but for Russians themselves.
So let's distinguish first the collapse of Russia and the collapse of the Putin regime, which is not the same thing. I think the collapse of Russia sort of break up into ethnic statelets the way it seemed to be possible in the 90s is less likely now, for a variety of reasons. But I think there is consensus in Ukraine and among the Russian opposition that anyone coming after Putin, no matter how nationalist, no matter how hardcore, no matter how imperial in thinking that person is, would be a good thing, because this is Putin's war, and Putin cannot end it. But anyone else can walk away from it and say it's not me. Mistakes were made. And I'm sorry, but too many wrong steps were taken by my predecessor. We have to unwind that legacy. And so I think there is no fear in Kyiv of someone worse than Putin. And we've seen it with Prigozhin. Prigozhin, who was the most extreme Russian nationalist in his last days, he did say, before launching the putsch, that the war was launched on false pretenses and there was a chance for peace, and why are we doing it? So now, is there fear in Washington? Is there fear in Moscow? Is there fear in Berlin? I think there was since the very beginning of this, there was a bit of too much presumption, I would think. There was this attempt to modulate the outcome. Like, we want Ukraine to win, but not too much. It's sort of this Goldilocks approach. And you can't really run a war in which your aim is not to achieve victory. You can't aim a war which you want to, to have enemy or to have your adversary, beaten by 75%, not by 85%. It's just, wars are unpredictable by their very nature. And that desire to weaken Russia, but not to defeat it, is what allowed Russia to survive, to rebuild its industrial complex, and to go on a counteroffensive. And so you have this sort of wild mood swings. In the summer, of 2023, there was a fear of Russia being too weak. Now there's a fear of Russia being too strong. But that all stems from the lack of clarity in the policy.
And another feature of the Russian invasion is extreme brutality. It's my belief that parts of the media are not covering it enough, and that includes Kakhovka and the terrible implications of that, but also things like the torture chambers that would discover what's happening to kidnapped children. And of course, I mean, Butcher and Irpin were covered, but propaganda put quite a smokescreen up to try and cover that up. Every Ukrainian is brought up with stories of the horrors of the past, which usually involve their direct relatives. They're brought up on stories of the sheer brutality of the Soviet Union, Russian forces, etc., and how Ukrainian independence has been snuffed out multiple times. And yet, it seems to me, talking to many Ukrainians, the sheer brutality, wastefulness, and horror of Russia's invasion has taken a lot of people by surprise, despite knowing, the history of the Stalinist period and so on.
Yeah, I think what has taken people by surprise is how okay so many people in Russia are with it. And I remember myself talking to a Russian expert the night before the invasion, and we knew that the war is coming. And as I was WhatsApping with him from Kyiv, he was in Moscow. But it's easy for the Russians to cheer on bombing Aleppo, bombing Grozny, because the Chechens, the Syrians are very much othered in the Russian imagination. But they keep saying that we are one people. Like, how can Putin explain leveling Kharkiv? And no problem. The othering worked really well, and everybody's the propaganda was perfect.
And Odessa,
Mariupol was destroyed, and not a peak in Russia about that. So I think people were surprised in Ukraine because, again, people know Russia's record historically, but also lots of people have friends and relatives in Russia and have traveled, and just the speed with which Ukrainians were dehumanized in Russia was stunning. And there are lots of people that I spoke to who were under bombs in Kharkiv, were calling their sisters, fathers sometimes in Russia, and telling them this is happening to me, how the Russians are killing my neighbors. And I said, no, I don't believe you. It's not true. It's the Nazis who are shooting at you. And that was a very, very common refrain.
And even in 20 Days in Mariupol, if people have seen that film, it's incredibly impactful. There's a point where a lot of people have fled, and there's a number of people are left, and they're clearly incredibly terrorized, and they're being told that it's the Russian army that's shelling them, and some of them simply won't believe it, even though they are the targets of that aggression, and even though there's tanks with a Z symbol, driving outside.
Correct.
This leads on to the last area, which is a sense of justice. Now, obviously, this is the other area where, despite all the conversations and the Western hesitation and vacillation, isn't one of the concerns of every Ukrainian that justice in its fullest sense cannot be achieved without victory. And you do not want to compromise on the one or the other. It's an impossible dilemma.
Well, I think the realities of war are hard now, especially that the U.S. funding has dried up, and the U.S. Congress, for now, has turned its back on Ukraine. And so I think we are in a phase of war that is again about survival, not about liberation necessarily in the immediate future. And so yes, Ukrainians want justice. Ukrainians want recognition of what happened to them. But for now, what they want most is the world not to turn its backs on them and to help sustain their defense. And because really dark days are ahead, and not really ahead upon us already, because the Ukraine's army has already begun running out of ammunition. The Russians once again have an overwhelming advantage in artillery firepower on the front lines, and this delay or refusal to provide aid is really measured in the lives of Ukrainians every day.
it's been told to me that if Ukraine is faced with losing territory or the defensive lines that are being created at the moment are actually challenged, that the West will panic and provided what's needed, but not in a strategic, timely fashion. Do you think that that is enough at this point? That the what's at stake is properly understood, and do you think US, Britain, and others will do what's right in the end?
Perhaps, perhaps it depends also on what other crises are at hand. But there is a cost of that, and the cost of that is the one resource that is not replenishable. You can always make more guns and supply more money, but Ukraine is running out of people, and the cost of this delay and the cost of this prevarication is generations of young Ukrainians.
And often, they're not culled from prisons or dragged from the streets in provincial areas. They're incredibly educated, cultured people. We've seen many significant cultural figures that have died. Just to end, then, what would be your, not an analysis, but as someone of Ukrainian heritage, what would you implore the West to do, and how would you communicate this, or encourage people to communicate it so that it really lands with policymakers and decision makers?
Well, I think if you look at what happened in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, if Russia had won in 2022, had overrun Kyiv, installed the puppet regime, it would have been a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but it would not have been a defeat of the West because the West had walked away. The US closed its embassy and said, "Have a nice day. Here's a box of javelins. Good luck." I think now, after hundreds of billions of dollars poured into Ukraine, after this massive Western commitment, political, military, economical, if after all that, the international community, the democracies of the world, walk away and allow Russia to win, that will be seen globally as Russia winning round two of Cold War. They will be seen globally as an alliance of Russian autocracies such as North Korea, Iran, and to an extent China, really establishing the dominance in the new order. And I think the implications for America's and the West's ability to influence events in the world in other areas of significant and strategic importance will be greatly diminished. People in America may not think it's their war, but people in Russia really think they're fighting against America. People across the global South often think the same.
That's an incredibly powerful place to end. I know you have to jump. You've got numerous interviews. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Can't wait to get my hands on a full printed copy so I can really sort of dive into it and make notes in there. I encourage people to check it out. It should win a lot of awards this year. Good luck with the launch and all the talks you're doing with that. And thank you so much for talking to the audience today.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the book.